At 4:47 a.m. on February 3, 1938, prisoner number 4471B, Ivan Alexeyevich Morozov, 31 years old, from the city of Yaroslav, stood at a road marker on kilometer 214 of the Kolyma highway when the temperature dropped to -58 degrees Celsius and the wind from the northeast reached 23 meters per second. He had been in Magadan for 11 months and 17 days. He weighed 44 kilograms. He had started at 78. His hands, wrapped in rags cut from a dead man's coat, held a pickaxe that weighed 4.2 kilograms. The metal had contracted in the cold. The wooden handle had split along the grain 3 weeks earlier and been repaired with wire salvaged from a collapsed fence post. He had 847 days remaining on his sentence. Behind him, stretching back 214 kilometers to the port of Magadan, lay a road built entirely by human hands and human bodies. Ahead of him, stretching into the frozen dark of the Kolyma interior, lay another 2,031 kilometers yet to be built. The quota for his brigade that day was 2.5 cubic meters of frozen ground per man. In February 1938, at kilometer 214, the temperature had not risen above -40 for 31 consecutive days. Ivan Morozov picked up his pickaxe. He did not know that 3 million men and women would pass through this system before it ended. He knew only that the guard had shouted the single word that began every morning in the Kolyma: Podyom, rise. Yaroslav sits 282 kilometers northeast of Moscow on the upper Volga River, in a bend where the water moves slowly in summer and freezes solid by November. In 1929, when Ivan Morozov was 22 years old, it was a city of 114,000 people, with textile mills, a rubber factory, and a theater that had been operating since 1750. The streets near the river were paved with cobblestone. The streets further from the river were not paved at all. Ivan was born on March 14, 1907, the second of 4 children, to Alexey Grigorovich Morozov, a lathe operator at the Yaroslav motor plant, and Natalia Ivanovna Morozova, née Kuznetsova, who kept the household and took in sewing work during the winter months when money was tight. The family lived in a 2-room apartment on Ulitsa Svobody, Freedom Street, in a building that housed 11 other families. There was one shared kitchen. There was no running hot water after 1932. Ivan finished 7 years of schooling at school number 4 in 1922 at the age of 15, which was considered a full secondary education for a working-class boy in the early Soviet period. His grades, recorded in a document that survived in the Yaroslav Regional Archive, were average in mathematics and above average in Russian literature and geography. His teacher, a woman named Valentina Semyonovna Chernova, noted in his final report that Ivan was attentive, reliable, and possessed of a calm temperament that served him well in difficult circumstances. He was 178 centimeters tall. He weighed 78 kilograms when he entered the camp system. He had brown hair, gray eyes, and a scar on his left forearm from a lathe accident that occurred in January 1931, when a metal shaving caught his skin at the motor plant where he had worked since the age of 17. He was a lathe operator like his father. He had worked at the Yaroslav motor plant for 11 years by the time of his arrest. He was, by all accounts that survive, a competent and steady worker. His production records, cited in the arrest file compiled by the NKVD in March 1937, show that he met or exceeded his quota in 43 of the 48 months between 1933 and 1937. He was a Stakhanovite in October 1935, meaning he exceeded his quota by more than 200% in that month, and received a certificate signed by the plant director and a cash bonus of 47 rubles. He married Zinaida Petrovna Volkova on June 8, 1930. She was 24, he was 23. The wedding was held in the apartment on Ulitsa Svobody with 12 guests. There are no photographs. They had 2 children, a daughter, Galina, born February 19, 1932, a son, Dmitri, born September 4, 1934. Galina was 5 years old when her father was arrested. Dmitri was 2. Ivan Morozov did not drink to excess. He was not a party member, though he was a member of the trade union, which was compulsory for workers at state enterprises. He had no prior criminal record. He had never been summoned to the NKVD before March 1937. He attended no church, made no political statements in public, and, so far as any surviving record indicates, had no enemies. He had one vulnerability, which is to say, he had one thing that could be used against him. His uncle, Fyodor Grigorovich Morozov, his father's brother, had been a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party before 1917. Fyodor had died of typhus in 1921, 16 years before Ivan's arrest, but the connection existed in the records, and in 1937 connections were enough. He spent his free time, of which there was little, reading. The family had 23 books, among them a collected edition of Pushkin's poetry, a technical manual for lathe operation, a primer on Soviet geography published in 1934, and a novel by Alexander Fadeev that Ivan had read 3 times. His wife Zinaida would later tell investigators in 1956 that Ivan had the habit of reading aloud to the children at night before bed. His preferred texts for this purpose were the geography primer and Pushkin. He had never been further from Yaroslav than Moscow, which he visited once in 1933 for a trade union conference. He returned the same week. He said Moscow was very large and very loud. He had no idea where Magadan was. When his arrest came, on morning of March 19, 1937, he had to ask the NKVD officer who the arresting warrant named as his destination, what Kolyma was, and where it was located. The officer did not answer. The arrest warrant for Ivan Alexeyevich Morozov was signed on March 17, 1937, by Senior Lieutenant Vasily Ivanovich Petrov of the Yaroslav NKVD office under Article 58, Paragraph 10 of the Soviet Criminal Code, Anti-Soviet Agitation and Propaganda. The specific accusation, as recorded in the file, was that Morozov had made a statement in the workers' canteen of the Yaroslav motor plant that the bread ration had been better before collectivization. A colleague whose name was redacted in the rehabilitation documents of 1958 had reported this statement. Whether the statement was made and in what context cannot be determined from surviving records. The arrest occurred at 5:22 in the morning. 2 officers arrived at the apartment on Ulitsa Svobody. Zinaida Morozova was awake, feeding Dmitri, who was 2 years old and had been ill with a chest cold for 6 days. Galina, who was 5, was asleep on the bed she shared with her brother in the second room. Ivan was given 11 minutes to dress and collect permitted personal items. The permitted personal items under NKVD Order number 00447 of July 30th, 1937 were 1 change of underclothing, 1 pair of boots, and personal documents. He was not permitted to take books. Zinaida Morozova would later describe in her 1956 testimony to the Commission on Rehabilitation that her husband's last words to her, spoken quietly so as not to wake Galina, were, "Take care of the children, I'll be back soon." He believed this. She said she believed it too at the time. He was held in the Yaroslav NKVD isolation facility, known as the Yaroslav Isolator, for 47 days. During this period, he was interrogated on 14 separate occasions. The interrogation records show that he denied the accusation at every session. On April 3rd, after the 7th interrogation session, he signed a confession. The confession, as was standard in 1937, had been written by the interrogating officer. It stated that Morozov had engaged in systematic anti-Soviet agitation among workers with the goal of undermining confidence in the leadership of the Communist Party. He was sentenced under a simplified procedure, a troika, a 3-person administrative tribunal, on May 4, 1937. The session lasted approximately 8 minutes. The sentence was 8 years of corrective labor in the Dalstroy system, northeastern USSR, beginning immediately. He was 30 years old. He did not see Zinaida or his children again. The transport from Yaroslav to Vladivostok took 28 days by rail in a Stolypin car, a converted passenger coach with barred windows and sealed compartments, each designed to hold 8 men, but typically carrying between 16 and 24. The car was not heated beyond the residual warmth of 20 or more bodies in a closed space. Food was distributed once per day, 600 grams of black bread and a cup of hot water with a small amount of salt herring. Water for drinking beyond this was not provided. Men collected snow from the edges of the window bars. Ivan Morozov arrived in Vladivostok on June 11, 1937. He had lost 6 kilograms during transport. He was housed in the Vladivostok transit camp, the Vlad per Punkt, for 22 days in a barracks designed for 300 men that held 740 during his stay. On July 3, 1937, he boarded the steamship SS Jurma, a converted cargo vessel operated by Dalstroy, for the crossing of the Sea of Okhotsk to Magadan. The crossing took 6 days. The Jurma carried 3,200 prisoners in its cargo holds. The holds were not ventilated. Men stood or sat on the floor in shifts because there was not enough room for all of them to sit simultaneously. 2 men died during the crossing and were buried at sea, their names recorded on a list that has since been lost. Ivan Morozov arrived in the port of Magadan on July 9, 1937. The temperature was 8 degrees Celsius. It was summer. He looked at the mountains surrounding the bay, the bare, gray, enormous mountains with no trees above the timberline, and understood, perhaps for the first time, the scale of what had been built here, and where he was, and how far he was from Yaroslav, and from Ulitsa Svobody, and from Zinaida, and from Galina, and from Dmitri, who was coughing and needed medicine. He was assigned prisoner number 4471B on July 9, 1937, at the Magadan reception and distribution point. He was processed, photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned to the Jagodniecki district camp cluster, Sevostlag, the northeastern corrective labor camps, specifically to the road construction subcamp at kilometer 214 of the Kolyma highway, known internally as Trasa. He was given camp clothing, a padded jacket, a pair of padded pants, a hat with ear flaps, and a pair of boots with soles made of tire rubber. The clothing was used. It had belonged to previous prisoners. The previous prisoners were not identified.
He was loaded onto a Gaz AA truck, a Soviet-built copy of the Ford Model AA, with 22 other men, and driven north along a road that was partly gravel, partly compacted earth, and partly the labor of the men who now rode on it. The road to kilometer 214 took 9 hours. To understand what Ivan Morozov entered on July 9, 1937, it is necessary to understand what Dalstroy was and how it worked, and how it had come to exist in one of the most remote and hostile places on the surface of the earth. Dalstroy, the Far North Construction Trust, was established by order of the Soviet Council of People's Commissars on November 11, 1931. Its official purpose was the extraction of gold from the Kolyma Basin, a river system in the northeastern corner of the USSR, encompassing approximately 2,600 square kilometers of territory, almost entirely above the Arctic Circle, entirely inaccessible by road from the rest of the Soviet Union, and characterized by some of the most extreme weather conditions on the planet. The Kolyma gold deposits had been identified by geological surveys beginning in 1926. The surveys confirmed that the region contained one of the largest gold reserves in the world, an estimated 200,000 tons of ore, with a gold content of between 3 and 15 grams per ton. The problem was logistics. There were no roads, there were no settlements of any size, there was no workforce, because no free person with access to alternatives would voluntarily relocate to the Kolyma. The solution, from the perspective of Soviet economic planning in 1931, was self-evident. Dalstroy's first director, Eduard Berzin, arrived in Magadan, then a small settlement of approximately 500 people, on February 4, 1932. He had 9,928 prisoners with him. By the end of 1932, there were 11,100 prisoners in the Kolyma system. By 1935, there were 36,800. By 1937, the year Ivan Morozov arrived, there were 70,000. By 1938, during the peak of the Great Terror, the number would rise to 138,000. The system would ultimately process more than 800,000 individual prisoners between 1932 and 1953, though when one accounts for repeat sentences and rearrests, the number of individual people who passed through the Kolyma approaches 3 million. The camp hierarchy at kilometer 214, where Ivan Morozov was assigned, was structured as follows. At the top, the camp commandant, Senior Lieutenant Fyodor Nikolaevich Gruzdev, 38 years old, a career NKVD officer who had been transferred from a camp in the Komi Republic in 1936. Gruzdev was responsible for 847 prisoners, divided into 23 brigades, for the construction of the road section between kilometer 190 and kilometer 240. He reported to the Jagodniecki district administration in the settlement of Jagodnie, 180 kilometers to the north. Below Gruzdev, 3 section commanders, each responsible for approximately 280 prisoners and a 16-kilometer section of road. Ivan Morozov's section commander was Junior Lieutenant Arkady Semyonovich Voronov, 29 years old, who had been in the Kolyma for 14 months. Below the section commanders, brigade leaders,
most of whom were prisoners themselves, selected from the criminal population, known as blatnie or urki. The brigade leaders held a position of terrifying power over their fellow prisoners. They controlled food distribution within the brigade, assigned work positions, and reported production figures to the section commanders. A brigade leader who reported good production numbers received additional food rations. A brigade leader who reported poor production numbers faced reduction of rations for the entire brigade, including himself. Ivan Morozov's brigade leader at kilometer 214 was a man named Gennady Viktorovich Sorokin, known to everyone in the camp as Soroka, the Magpie. Sorokin was 41 years old. He was serving a 10-year sentence for armed robbery, his third criminal conviction. He had been in the Kolyma since 1934. He weighed approximately 85 kilograms, which in the Kolyma was an extraordinary weight, explicable only by his position as brigade leader and his corresponding access to additional food.
Soroka's method of maintaining discipline within the brigade was straightforward. Men who worked met the quota. Men who met the quota ate. Men who did not meet the quota did not eat, or ate less, which meant they were weaker the following day, which meant they were less likely to meet the quota, which was a mathematical trajectory with a single destination. The daily food ration at kilometer 214 in the summer of 1937 for prisoners who met the production quota was 900 grams of black bread, 60 grams of fish, salted or dried, 25 grams of groats for the morning soup, and 25 grams of groats for the evening soup with a small amount of fat. For prisoners who did not meet the quota, the ration was reduced to 600 grams of bread and 1 soup per day. For prisoners in punishment ration status, those who had failed to meet quota for 3 or more consecutive days, the ration was 400 grams of bread and water. The daily work quota for road construction in the summer was 2.5 cubic meters of earth moved per man per day. In winter, when the ground was frozen to a depth of 1.5 meters and had to be broken with pickaxes before it could be shoveled, the quota was officially reduced to 1.5 cubic meters. In practice, the quota was rarely adjusted to account for ground conditions, and the arithmetic was always the same. Men who could not meet it ate less, weakened, met it less, ate less still. The 23 brigades at kilometer 214 in the summer of 1937 included 412 political prisoners under Article 58, the counter-revolutionaries, saboteurs, anti-Soviet agitators, and enemies of the people, of which Ivan Morozov was one. Another 287 were criminal prisoners, serving sentences for theft, robbery, assault, or economic crimes. The remaining 148 were recidivists, men serving second or third sentences, a category that typically ensured the harshest treatment and the most dangerous work assignments. The barracks at kilometer 214 were wooden structures, each housing between 60 and 80 men in a space designed, according to the original construction specifications, for 40. The walls were single-planked, one layer of rough lumber with gaps between the boards that admitted wind in winter. The floor was packed earth. Each barracks had a single iron stove that burned local wood, which in the Kolyma was predominantly larch, a dense, slow-burning wood that produced significant heat but required constant tending. The stove was the responsibility of the men assigned to it, which meant that on the coldest nights men woke in rotation to feed wood into it, because if the stove went out, the temperature inside the barracks would equalize with the temperature outside in approximately 2 hours. In January and February, the temperature outside was between -45 and -60 degrees Celsius. This is the world Ivan Morozov entered on July 9, 1937. If you want to know how Ivan Morozov tried to survive inside the world that Dalstroy built,
inside the machinery of Kilometer 214, inside the brigades and the quotas and the winters that turned iron brittle. Stay with us. This story has not been told in full before, because the documents were sealed for decades and the survivors were told to be silent. Like this video if you want these forgotten stories to reach the people who need to hear them. And subscribe if you haven't already. Every view tells the algorithm that this history matters. Ivan Morozov had been at Kilometer 214 for 97 days. The signal for morning reveille at the camp was not a bell. It was a length of rail hung from a wooden frame at the center of the compound, struck 3 times by an iron rod by whichever guard had drawn the morning duty. The sound carried in the cold air with a clarity that had no parallel in ordinary life, a single sustained metallic tone that did not echo because there was nothing in the flat, treeless terrain surrounding the camp for sound to bounce from. It simply rang and faded into the dark. At 5 a.m. on October 14, 1937, that sound reached Barracks Number 7 through walls that were now, with the onset of the Kolyma autumn, inadequate against temperatures that had been dropping consistently for 6 weeks. The interior temperature of the barracks, measured that morning by the camp medic Nikolai Fyodorovich Kostenko in a log that survived in the Magadan Regional Archive, was -23 degrees Celsius. The stove had gone cold at approximately 3:30 a.m. when the last man assigned to night tending, a former school teacher from Minsk named Arkady Berenson, had fallen asleep from exhaustion for 17 hours of work the previous day.
Ivan awoke at the sound of the rail. He had not been deeply asleep. In the Kolyma, men in the early months of their sentences rarely achieved genuine sleep. The cold prevented it, and the fear of oversleeping and missing formation prevented it, and the sounds of 67 other men in varying states of distress and unconsciousness prevented it. He had been in a state that experienced prisoners called the half, a suspended condition between sleep and waking, in which the body rested partially, but the mind maintained a low, continuous vigilance. He sat up on his bunk, the 3rd level, near the wall, which was the coldest position because the wall transmitted the exterior temperature directly. He had been assigned this bunk on his first day because bunk assignment in Barracks Number 7 was controlled by Soroka, and Soroka assigned the warmest positions, the lower bunks near the stove, to men who had been in the camp longest, who were criminal prisoners or who had something to offer. Ivan Morozov, on July 9th, had nothing to offer. He dressed in the dark, which took 4 minutes because dressing in the Kolyma at this temperature required a specific sequence. First, the foot rags, strips of cloth wrapped around the feet in a method that the older prisoners had taught him in July, when it was still 8 degrees above zero and the technique had seemed unnecessary. Then the inner boot, which was made of felt. Then the outer boot, which was rubber-soled. Then the padded trousers. Then the padded jacket, which he had reinforced along the collar with a strip of burlap he had found near the garbage dump behind the kitchen. Then the hat, which he wore with the ear flaps down at all times now. He had lost 14 kilograms since his arrival. He weighed 64 kilograms. His hands, which had been the hands of a lathe operator, strong, calloused, capable, were now additionally scarred along the knuckles from 2 months of pickaxe work on frozen ground. The first 2 fingers of his right hand had experienced mild frostbite in September and recovered, but the skin was now permanently darker at the tips, and in very cold temperatures he could feel a specific ache in those fingertips that was different from ordinary cold pain. Formation was at 5:30.
The 23 brigades assembled in the central compound in columns, each brigade standing 4 abreast, and were counted by the section guards. The count at kilometer 214 was conducted twice each morning, once by the brigade leaders internally and once by the guards externally. If the two counts did not match, the entire camp stood at formation until the discrepancy was resolved. On October 14, 1937, the morning count took 23 minutes because one prisoner in Brigade 11, a man named Stepan Lukov from Rostov-on-Don, had died during the night and had not been moved from his bunk. The guard who discovered him in the internal count reported the body, and the external count had to be adjusted. Lukov was 44 years old. He had been at kilometer 214 for 6 months. He died of what the camp medic recorded as cardiovascular failure secondary to general physical exhaustion. He weighed 39 kilograms. Ivan stood in formation for 23 minutes in minus 38 degrees Celsius. He had learned from a prisoner named Vasily Gromov, who had been in the Kolyma since 1933 and who occupied the bunk directly below Ivan's, to shift weight from foot to foot continuously during formation, a technique that maintained circulation and reduced the risk of frostbite in the feet. Gromov had also taught him to keep his hands pressed flat against his body under his jacket during formation, rather than hanging at his sides, where blood would pool away from the core. Gromov was 47 years old. He was a former engineer from Leningrad, serving a 10-year sentence for wrecking, the accusation that he had deliberately sabotaged a factory machine. He was the most important person Ivan Morozov had encountered in the Kolyma, not because of any dramatic act of kindness, but because he shared practical knowledge without expectation of return, which in the Kolyma was a form of generosity as rare and significant as anything he had encountered in his civilian life. After formation, the brigades marched to the worksite. Brigade 7, which was Ivan's, was assigned to the section between kilometer 214 and kilometer 216, a 2-kilometer stretch where the roadbed had been partially constructed in summer but required deepening and widening to meet the specifications for winter vehicle traffic. The worksite was 1.4 kilometers from the barracks compound, along a path that the prisoners had worn into the frozen ground over months of daily transit.
The tools assigned to Brigade 7 on October 14 were 22 pickaxes, 22 shovels, 4 crowbars, and 2 wooden wheelbarrows with iron wheels. The wheelbarrows were used to move excavated material from the road cut to the spoil pile. At minus 38 degrees, the metal components of all these tools had contracted, and the wooden handles of the pickaxes and shovels were loose in their ferrules, which increased the shock transmitted to the hands with each blow and accelerated the onset of hand numbness. The daily quota for Brigade 7 on October 14 was 1.5 cubic meters per man. There were 22 working men in the brigade. One had been removed to the medical barracks the previous day with an infected foot wound. The total brigade quota was 33 cubic meters of frozen material to be excavated and removed from the road cut. Ivan's personal position in the brigade's work system was as a picker, a man who broke the frozen surface with a pickaxe to allow the shovelers behind him to load the loosened material. The picking position was considered the most physically demanding, and it was assigned either to the strongest men or to those who had earned it as a form of extra quota burden imposed by Soroka for various infractions. Ivan had been a picker since his 3rd week in the camp.
initially because he was new and strong relative to many in the brigade, and subsequently because Soroka had determined that Ivan was reliable in this role and that his output was consistent. The sound of a pickaxe striking frozen Kolyma ground is not the sound of metal on earth. It is the sound of metal on stone. The frozen soil of the Kolyma basin, permafrost that extended in some areas to a depth of 200 meters, had the density and resistance of granite. A full swing of a 4-kilogram pickaxe against frozen Kolyma ground in October produced a penetration of approximately 3 to 4 centimeters, releasing chips of frozen earth that flew backward with the velocity of flung stones. Men worked with their faces turned partly away from the strike point, squinting against the flying chips. At 7:14 a.m., 1 hour and 44 minutes into the work period, the temperature at the worksite dropped to -41 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, the breath of 22 working men formed a continuous low cloud of water vapor over the worksite that settled onto every exposed surface as a thin layer of frost within minutes. Ivan's eyebrows, the stubble on his jaw, and the exposed portion of his scarf where it covered his mouth were frosted white by 7:30. The frost on his scarf created a problem. Moisture from his breath condensed on the scarf fabric and then froze, making the fabric rigid and reducing its insulating capacity. By 8 a.m., the portion of the scarf covering his mouth had frozen solid, and he was breathing partly around it. He struck the ground 847 times in the first 2 hours of work. He counted. Counting was something Gromov had recommended, not for measurement, but for psychological anchoring. Count something, Gromov had told him in July. Anything. It gives the mind something to hold on to besides the cold. At 10 a.m., there was a 20-minute food break. The food break consisted of hot water delivered in a metal tank on a wooden sledge by 2 work zone assistants. There was no food. The hot water, it was not tea, it was not broth, it was water that had been heated, was distributed in metal cups that each prisoner carried on a string attached to his jacket. The water cooled to below 40 degrees Celsius within approximately 90 seconds of being poured into the metal cup in -41-degree air. Men drank it immediately, before it could cool, burning their lips and tongues rather than waste the heat. Ivan held his cup in both hands for 8 seconds before drinking. The warmth through his gloves was at that moment the primary sensation in his body. The work period continued until 6 p.m., 12 hours of labor, with a 20-minute break and a 30-minute midday break when a thin soup was delivered from the camp kitchen. The soup on October 14 was water in which salted fish heads had been boiled, with a small amount of barley. It contained approximately 180 calories. It was consumed in the open air at the worksite, standing, because there was no shelter at the site, and sitting on the frozen ground was dangerous. The cold conducted upward through the ground at a rate sufficient to cause hypothermia in a stationary person within 20 minutes.
At 5:47 p.m., with 13 minutes remaining in the production period, Ivan Morozov's production for the day reached 1.4 cubic meters of material broken and cleared. He needed 1.5 to meet the quota. He worked faster. He met the quota at 5:59 p.m., 1 minute before the end of the work period. Soroka noted the figure in his production ledger. 1.5 cubic meters, quota met, full ration. Ivan Morozov walked back to barracks number 7 in the dark. The temperature at 6:15 p.m. was -44 degrees Celsius. The walk took 18 minutes.
He could not feel his feet for the last 6 minutes of the walk, and the first thing he did upon entering the barracks was remove his outer boots and examine his feet for white patches that would indicate frostbite onset. His feet were intact. He had been in the Kolyma for 97 days. He had 2,831 days remaining on his sentence. The man's name was Pavel Ilyich Savelyev. He was 38 years old. He had been a bookkeeper in a collective farm administration in the Voronezh region. He had been at kilometer 214 for 4 months, having arrived in the same transport as Ivan Morozov. He weighed, on the day he died, approximately 41 kilograms. He had been on reduced ration, 600 grams of bread per day, for 11 consecutive days, because his production had fallen below quota consistently since early November, when the temperature had dropped to a range at which a man of his physical condition and weight could not sustain the energy expenditure required for the work quota. Ivan knew Pavel. They had spoken on the transport from Vladivostok in the dark of the Zhurma's cargo hold during the 6-day crossing. Pavel had a daughter named Vera, who was 12. He had spoken of her often on the transport, a nervous, repetitive form of speech that Ivan recognized as a coping mechanism, the repeated invocation of the specific and beloved as a defense against the abstract enormity of what was happening. Vera liked to draw. Vera was good at arithmetic. Vera had a cat named Mirka. Pavel died at 2:15 p.m. on November 28, 1937, while shoveling material into a wheelbarrow. He did not fall dramatically. He sat down. He sat down on the frozen ground at the edge of the road cut, and then he lay down, and then he did not move. The guard at the worksite, a young private named Konstantin Ryabov, 20 years old, from Saratov, who had been in the Kolyma for 3 months and who, by all available evidence, had not yet achieved the emotional insulation that longer service typically produced, walked to where Pavel lay and called his name twice. Then he called for the brigade medic, a prisoner named Lev Abramovich Feinstein, who had been a physician in Kharkov before his arrest. Feinstein examined Pavel Savelyev at 2:19 p.m. He found no pulse. He recorded the time of death as 2:17 p.m. The cause he noted in his medical journal as cardiac failure secondary to extreme physical exhaustion and nutritional deficiency. Pavel Savelyev weighed 41 kilograms. His normal pre-arrest weight, according to his intake record, had been 74 kilograms. The work period continued. This was not callousness specifically. It was the operational reality of the camp system. The quota did not pause for death, and men who stopped working because a fellow prisoner had died would themselves fall below quota and eat less and weaken. The system's internal logic was complete and self-reinforcing. Ivan Morozov continued to pick at the frozen ground after Pavel Savelyev's body was loaded onto the sledge that had delivered the morning hot water and taken back to the camp. He worked without pause. He met his quota that day. He ate his full ration. That evening, on the 3rd bunk from the wall in barracks number 7, he lay in his padded clothing and did not sleep for a period he estimated later at approximately 2 hours. He thought about Pavel Savelyev and about Vera, who liked to draw. He thought about Galina, who was 5 years old, and whom he had last seen on the morning of March 19th in the apartment on Ulitsa Svoboda, asleep in the bed she shared with Dmitri. He did not allow himself to think about this for long. It was something he had learned, not from Gromov, but from his own internal experience of the preceding 4 months, that certain thoughts had to be rationed, held at a distance, visited briefly, and then set aside, because to open them fully was to encounter something that interfered with the capacity to function the following morning.
He fell asleep at approximately 9 p.m., 2 hours after lights out. He woke at 5 a.m. when the rail rang. The temperature outside was minus 51 degrees Celsius. He dressed in 4 minutes and went to formation. Senior Lieutenant Gruzdev called Ivan Morozov to the administration building on the evening of December 19, 1937. This was an extraordinary event. Prisoners were not typically summoned to the commandant's office except for disciplinary matters, and a disciplinary summons was a source of significant fear, because discipline in the Kolyma in December 1937 ranged from ration reduction to transfer to a penalty brigade to, in extreme cases, referral to the NKVD Troika for additional sentence. Ivan was escorted from barracks number 7 by a guard at 7:15 p.m. The temperature outside was minus 47 degrees Celsius. The walk to the administration building took 4 minutes across the open compound, and he covered it as quickly as he could without appearing to run, because running was prohibited in the compound. The administration building was a log structure heated by a proper iron stove with a continuous fuel supply. The interior temperature was approximately 18 degrees Celsius. Ivan, who had not been in a genuinely warm space since his arrest in March, experienced the warmth of the building as a physical shock, a sudden involuntary relaxation of muscles that had been held in a low-grade contraction against the cold for months. Gruzdev was seated behind a wooden desk. He was a large man, 52 years old at that point, with a grey mustache and the flat, practiced expression of a career administrator. He had a file open on the desk in front of him. He looked at Ivan for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You are a lathe operator." Ivan confirmed that he was. Gruzdev said that the workshop, a facility used to maintain the camp's vehicles, tools, and mechanical equipment, had lost its primary machinist to the hospital 2 weeks ago. The machinist, a prisoner named Zhukov, had suffered severe frostbite to both hands and would not work again in any capacity requiring manual dexterity. The workshop required someone who could operate the lathe that was used, among other things, to fabricate replacement parts for the camp's 3 Gaz trucks and its single-tracked vehicle, a Stalinez tractor used for the heaviest earth-moving. Gruzdev asked if Ivan had ever worked on automotive components. Ivan said yes, at the Yaroslav motor plant for 11 years. Gruzdev looked at the file again. He made a notation. He told Ivan to return to his barracks. He would be informed of the decision. Ivan walked back across the compound in minus 47 degrees. He did not know what had just happened or what it meant. 3 days later, on December 22, 1937, he was transferred from Brigade 7 to the camp workshop, effective immediately. His work assignment changed from road construction to mechanical maintenance. His ration was reclassified to the technical specialist category, which was 100 grams of bread more per day than the standard quota ration, plus a weekly supplement of 30 grams of fat. This was in the precise arithmetic of the Kolyma, the difference between survival and the trajectory that ended Pavel Savelyev. Ivan Morozov understood this. Gromov, who was not transferred with him and remained in Brigade 7, understood it too. On the evening of December 21st, the night before Ivan's transfer, Gromov said to him, "Don't feel guilty. Survive. That's the only thing that matters. Survive, and remember." Ivan Morozov remembered that sentence for the rest of his life. The workshop was a log building, larger than the barracks, with a corrugated iron roof that amplified the sound of wind during storms to a continuous metallic roar.
It was heated by 2 stoves rather than 1 because the metal equipment required temperatures above freezing to function. Lubricants thickened at -10 degrees and became non-functional at -20 degrees, which meant that a workshop operating in the Colima required substantial heating simply to maintain mechanical operability.
The workshop temperature of 4 degrees Celsius was not warm by any ordinary standard, but it was 56 degrees warmer than the outdoor temperature on January 7, 1938, and after 5 months of working outside in the Colima winter, the relative warmth felt to Ivan Morozov like a physiological gift of an order he could not fully articulate. The lathe in the workshop was a Soviet-manufactured 1K62 model, produced at the Red Pro Intern plant in Bryansk. It was 3 years old. It had been brought to kilometer 214 on a flatbed truck in the summer of 1936, a journey that had taken 6 days over roads that were, in many sections, not yet roads, but graded earth. It was, despite the conditions, in functioning order, maintained by Zhukov before his injury with a rigor that Ivan found admirable and that he would continue. The workshop supervisor was a free employee, one of the paid civilian specialists that Dalstroy brought to the Colima with contracts, hazard pay supplements, and the authority to requisition materials from the central Magadan supply. His name was Stepan Vladimirovich Kuzmin. He was 34 years old, from Sverdlovsk, and he had been in the Colima for 22 months on a 3-year contract. He was not cruel. He was not kind. He was a practical man who needed the lathe to produce parts and who evaluated the men under him by the single criterion of whether they could do the work. Ivan could do the work. On his first day, Kuzmin showed him the maintenance backlog, a list of 14 components requiring fabrication or repair. Among them, a replacement bearing housing for the Stalinez tractor, 2 new kingpins for a Gaz truck, a set of replacement bushings for the workshop's own drill press. Ivan reviewed the list and estimated fabrication times. Kuzmin listened to his estimates. He said nothing. He went to his desk and made notations. Ivan began with the bearing housing because the tractor was inactive, and without the tractor, the earth-moving quota for the entire camp section was reduced by approximately 30%. He worked 10 hours that day, from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., with a 30-minute lunch break. The lunch was the same soup that the road crew received, but it was eaten inside at 4 degrees Celsius rather than outside at -50. And the difference in the eating experience, simply the ability to hold the bowl in 2 hands without gloves and feel the warmth conduct through the metal into his palms, was significant in ways that were difficult to explain to someone who had not experienced its absence. He met the quota. The bearing housing was finished to specification by day 3. Kuzmin examined it. He measured it with a micrometer. He said, "Acceptable," which from Kuzmin, as Ivan would learn, was high praise. But the workshop had its own structure, its own dangers, its own specific form of the Colima's universal pressure. There were 4 other prisoners assigned to the workshop: a welder named Timofey Romanenko, a carpenter named Grigory Khazin, who handled the wooden components, a general laborer named Boris Petrov, who swept, carried, and assisted wherever needed, and a second machinist, a man named Alexei Dubrov, who had been in the workshop since 1935, and who had, in that time, developed a relationship with Kuzmin that gave him a degree of influence over work assignments and tool access. Dubrov was 36 years old, from Moscow, a former factory worker serving a 5-year sentence for theft of state property. He was, in the camp context, a blatnoy, a criminal prisoner, and he operated according to the logic of the criminal prisoner's world: hierarchy, favor, debt, and the systematic exploitation of every resource and relationship available. He had not expected another skilled machinist to arrive in his workshop.
Ivan became aware of this on his third day, when he reached for a specific micrometer that he needed to measure the kingpin he was fabricating, and found it was not in the tool chest where Kuzmin had told him the precision instruments were stored. He asked Petrov, the laborer, where it might be. Petrov looked at the floor and said he didn't know.
Dubrov was at his workstation at the other end of the shop. He did not look up. Ivan improvised a measurement approach using a different instrument and finished the kingpin. It was within tolerance. This was the beginning of a tension that would characterize his months in the workshop. Not the violence of the road crews, not the physical danger of the Kolyma winter outdoors, but a quiet, persistent form of interference that required constant alertness to navigate. Tools went missing. Material allocations were skewed. Kuzmin received reports of Ivan's production that were, occasionally, subtly inaccurate in the downward direction. Ivan learned to document his own output in a small notebook that Kuzmin had provided for the parts log, noting times, measurements, completion dates in his own hand, in a format that could be cross-checked against the physical components. He did not confront Dubrov directly. He did not report to Kuzmin, because reporting was dangerous. It created conflict, and conflict in the camp context had unpredictable consequences. He adapted, he recorded, he produced. This was, in its own way, a form of resistance. Ivan Morozov had written 6 letters to Zinaida since his arrival in Magadan. The letters were written on the single sheet of paper per month that prisoners were permitted under Dalstroy regulations, in pencil, and submitted to the camp administration for censorship review before mailing. The censorship process typically added between 2 and 6 weeks to delivery time. Letters from the Kolyma to European Russia could take between 6 and 14 weeks in total transit time, owing to the irregularity of mail transport from Magadan to Vladivostok and from Vladivostok west. He had received 2 letters from Zinaida. The first had arrived in September 1937. The second had arrived in December. Both had been read by camp censors. Passages were struck through in ink in both, and both contained the information that Zinaida and the children were alive and were living in the apartment on Ulitsa Svobody. The December letter mentioned that Galina was now attending school. It mentioned that Dmitri's cough had improved. It did not mention money, which meant either that Zinaida had not wanted to worry him, or that money was a subject the censor would not pass. The second interpretation seemed more likely. On February 3, 1938, Ivan wrote his 7th letter. He wrote it during the 30-minute lunch break on the bench near the workshop stove, holding the pencil in fingers that were stiff despite the relative warmth. He wrote carefully because paper could not be wasted, and because the letter would be read by at least 3 people, the censor, the postal censor, and Zinaida, and he had to write in a way that conveyed what he needed to convey, while avoiding language that the censor would remove, or that would cause alarm disproportionate to its usefulness. He wrote that he was in good health. This was partly true. He had survived the winter so far, which was more than many had managed, and his transfer to the workshop had stabilized his physical condition. He wrote that he was working in a mechanical role that suited his skills. He did not mention the cold, because he had learned in his previous letters that references to weather were struck through by the censor. He wrote that he thought of her and of Galina and of Dmitri every day. He wrote that he hoped Dmitri's health was continuing to improve. He did not write, "I do not know if I will survive this." He did not write, "I have watched men die from cold and hunger and exhaustion, and I have continued working while their bodies were loaded onto sledges because there was no alternative." He did not write, "I think about Vera Savelyeva, who is 12 and who likes to draw and who will probably not see her father again." He wrote,
I think of you every morning. Take care of the children. I will come home.
He folded the letter and gave it to the guard at the workshop door, who would pass it to the administration. Whether it arrived, whether any of his letters arrived, he could not know until he received a response, and responses came irregularly and with delays of months. That evening, working late on a replacement shaft for the tractor's power takeoff unit, Ivan Morozov experienced what he would later describe in a single sentence in the memoir fragments that survive in the Yaroslav Regional Archive as a moment of clarity about what was required to survive. The clarity was this, that survival in the Kolyma was not primarily a physical problem, though it had enormous physical dimensions. It was a problem of maintaining, in conditions designed to eliminate it, a coherent interior life, a sense of oneself as a person with a history and a future, and a reason to continue the effort that each day required. The tools were the letters, the counting, the work precisely done, better than required, the memory of Yaroslav and Ulitsa Svobody, the geography primer that he no longer had but could reconstruct from memory, Gromov's voice saying, "Survive and remember." He finished the shaft at 8:47 p.m., 2 hours after the official end of the work period. Kuzmin was still at his desk. He looked up at the completed part and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Go to bed, Morozov." Ivan put the shaft on the completed work shelf, hung his tools in order, and walked to barracks number 7 in the dark. The temperature was -58 degrees Celsius. The NKVD officer arrived at kilometer 214 on March 2, 1938. His name was Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Pavlovich Sukhov. He was 31 years old, from Chelyabinsk, and he carried with him a list of names, prisoners at the camp, who were to be reinterrogated under the expanded repression orders of Operational Order number 00447, which had been in effect since July 1937, and which by early 1938 had resulted in the execution of more than 750,000 people across the Soviet Union. Ivan Morozov's name was on the list. The reason was the uncle, Fyodor Grigorovich Morozov, the socialist revolutionary who had died of typhus in 1921. In the records, Fyodor's party membership had been noted at the time of Ivan's initial arrest. Now, in March 1938, someone in the Yaroslav NKVD office had generated an additional report suggesting that Ivan had maintained contact with underground socialist revolutionary networks through his uncle's connections. The report was fabricated. Fyodor had been dead for 17 years, and Ivan was a child when he died. But in the operational reality of March 1938, the distinction between fabricated and factual accusations was not a meaningful category. Ivan was summoned from the workshop at 11 p.m. He understood immediately from the manner of the guard who came for him, and from the fact that it was 11 p.m. rather than a daytime hour, that this was different from his December summons to Gruzdiev's office. Sukhov conducted the interrogation in the administration building. It lasted 4 hours and 22 minutes. The interrogation record, which was declassified in 1992 and is held in the Magadan Regional Archive, shows that Sukhov asked Ivan to confirm his connections to the Socialist Revolutionary Party through his uncle. Ivan denied any connections. He stated repeatedly that his uncle had died in 1921, when Ivan was 14 years old, and he had had no contact with any political organization beyond the compulsory trade union membership. Sukhov asked Ivan if he knew of other prisoners at the camp who held anti-Soviet views. Ivan said he did not.
Sukov asked this question in various formulations 11 times during the interrogation. His answer did not change.
At 3:22 a.m., Sukov changed his approach. He told Ivan that a confession confirming the socialist revolutionary connections would result in the addition of 5 years to his existing sentence. He told Ivan that a refusal to confess would result in referral to the NKVD Troika for possible imposition of the highest measure of social protection, the standard euphemism for execution. Ivan said he could not confess to connections that did not exist. There was a silence of approximately 2 minutes according to the interrogation record, which is unusual. Interrogation records typically do not note pauses. Then Sukov closed the file and told Ivan to return to his barracks. The interrogation resulted ultimately in no additional action. This was not because Sukov believed Ivan's denials, or because he was moved by Ivan's refusal to fabricate testimony against others. It was because the quota of additional sentences and executions that Sukov's operational unit was required to fulfill in the week prior to his visit to Kilometer 214, and the additional cases were not operationally necessary. Ivan Morozov survived this particular reckoning by the arithmetic of bureaucratic quotas, which was neither justice nor mercy, but simply the arbitrary application of systematic terror. He returned to barracks number 7 at 3:47 a.m. He did not sleep. At 5 a.m. the rail rang, and he rose and dressed and went to formation. He told no one about the interrogation, not Gromov, not Romanenko in the workshop. It was not a secret he kept out of fear of being overheard, but out of a recognition that describing it served no purpose, and that the internal experience of the preceding 4 hours was something he needed to compress and set aside, rather than expand through retelling. He worked his full shift. He met his production quota. He was 31 years old. The winter of 1938-1939 brought to Kilometer 214 an outbreak of pellagra, the nutritional deficiency disease caused by insufficient niacin, which manifests as a triad of dermatitis, diarrhea, and dementia. It was not the first outbreak in the Kolyma. Pellagra had been documented in the camps since 1933, but the winter of 1938-1939 was, by the testimony of camp medic Kostenko and the medical logs that survive, the most severe outbreak at this particular camp. The disease progressed through the camp systematically through January and February. The first cases were identified in early January, prisoners who had been on reduced rations for extended periods, whose skin had begun to develop the characteristic rash, whose bowel function had become severely disrupted. By mid-February, Kostenko had identified 67 cases, which represented 8% of the camp's prisoner population of approximately 820 men. Ivan Morozov did not develop pellagra. His assignment to the workshop, with its slightly elevated ration, had prevented the most severe nutritional deficiencies, but he watched it spread through barracks number 7, and he watched what it did, and the medical log entries that Kostenko made during this period, which Ivan was not supposed to have read, but which he did read on one occasion when Kostenko left the log in the workshop during a maintenance call, and which he memorized with a methodical attention to specific detail that had characterized his entire experience of the Kolyma, describe a progression that was, in the language of clinical documentation, more disturbing than any dramatization could be. Kostenko noted on February 14, 1939, patient Ivanov, P.V., prisoner number 3847, presenting with advanced pellagrous dementia. Patient does not recognize barracks, does not respond consistently to his name, has twice attempted to leave the barracks without clothing at external temperatures of approximately -50 degrees Celsius, has been restrained for his own protection. Nutritional intervention insufficient given available resources. Patient Ivanov was 33 years old. He had been a school teacher in Samarkand. He had spoken in the early months at the camp with great precision about the history of architecture.
He died on February 21, 1939, weighing 37 kilograms. Gromov did not develop full pellagra, but developed what Kostenko recorded as subclinical pellagrous symptoms, moderate dermatitis on his hands and forearms, some gastrointestinal disruption, and what Kostenko described as reduced cognitive clarity compared to baseline. Gromov himself noted to Ivan, in a conversation in late February, that he was having difficulty with complex calculations, that numbers, which had always been effortless for him as an engineer, were becoming slippery, requiring more effort to hold in his mind than they had previously. He described it with scientific detachment that Ivan found both admirable and frightening.
Ivan brought Gromov, twice during the epidemic period, small amounts of food from the workshop. Specifically, on 2 occasions when Kuzmin had left a portion of his own lunch uneaten, and the food sat on Kuzmin's desk, and Ivan was alone in the workshop, he took the food, a piece of bread, a small boiled potato, and brought it to Gromov in Barracks No. 7 after the work period. This was theft of state property, technically, and it was a risk. He accepted the risk. Gromov survived the winter of 1938 to 1939. He recovered partially. The dermatitis resolved when spring brought slightly improved nutritional conditions. The cognitive effects improved more slowly. By summer, he was, by his own assessment, approximately 80% of his pre-epidemic self. He said this without self-pity, as a simple engineering estimate. The epidemic killed 34 men at kilometer 214 in January and April 1939. They were buried in the frozen ground at the edge of the camp, in graves that could only be dug when the ground was blasted with improvised explosive charges, because no pickaxe could penetrate it to a depth sufficient for internment. The stakes were marked with wooden stakes. The stakes were not inscribed. By 1940, Ivan Morozov had been in the Kolyma for 3 years. He weighed 61 kilograms, 3 kilograms less than when he had arrived, but 17 kilograms more than his February 1938 low point. His hands were scarred, roughened, and permanently marked by the cold of 3 winters, but they were functional. His eyesight had deteriorated, a common outcome of prolonged nutritional deficiency, which affected the optic nerve, and he had difficulty with fine detail work without squinting. Kuzmin had, at some point in 1939, provided him with a pair of reading glasses taken from a prisoner who had died. The glasses were not Ivan's prescription, but they were better than nothing. He had, over 3 years in the workshop, become genuinely indispensable to Kuzmin in a way that Kuzmin acknowledged not through praise, but through practical actions, increasing Ivan's tool access, assigning him to the more complex fabrication tasks, occasionally leaving him alone in the workshop, a significant expression of trust in the camp context. In the summer of 1940, Kuzmin received a set of specifications from the Yagodninsky District Administration for the fabrication of a specialized coupling component for a new type of compressor that Dalstroy was deploying in the gold extraction facilities to the north. The specifications were complex. The component required tolerances of plus or minus 0.02 millimeters across several critical dimensions, and the material was a chrome steel alloy that behaved differently from the mild steel Ivan had primarily worked with. Kuzmin showed Ivan the specifications. He said, "Can you do this?" Ivan studied the drawings for 11 minutes. Then he said, "Yes." He spent 6 days on the first component.
The first attempt failed, a misalignment in the lathe setup that he caught before completing the cut, which would have wasted the material. He reconfigured the setup. The second attempt produced a component that measured within 0.018 millimeters on the critical dimension, inside tolerance. Kuesman sent the component to Jagodnoye. 2 weeks later, he received written confirmation from the district technical department that the component was fully acceptable. With the note was an authorization for a production bonus of 1 additional hot meal per week for a period of 4 weeks. Ivan received 4 additional hot meals. Each consisted of a piece of boiled fish and a ladle of thick barley porridge. He ate each of them slowly, deliberately, tasting every component. He had been in the Kolyma for 3 years and 1 month. He had 1,734 days remaining on his sentence. Vasily Fyodorovich Gromov, formerly a senior engineer at the Elektrosila plant in Leningrad, prisoner number 2197K, died on the morning of October 17, 1940, in Barracks number 7, during the 30-minute interval between the morning reveille signal and the formation assembly. He was 50 years old. He had been in the Kolyma for 7 years and 4 months.
The medic Kostenko recorded the cause of death as acute cardiac failure. The phrase meant, in the context of the camp's medical vocabulary, that the body had reached the point at which the accumulated burden of years of cold, malnutrition, and extreme physical labor had exceeded its capacity to continue. Gromov had spoken to Ivan the previous evening in the 20 minutes between the end of the work period and lights out. He had seemed tired, which was not unusual, and his breathing had been slightly labored, which was, by October 1940, a chronic condition attributed to what Kostenko believed was mild emphysema from years of breathing cold air during heavy work. He had talked about engineering, specifically about a problem in thermal expansion that he had been working through in his mind, a theoretical problem, unconnected to any practical application, a purely intellectual exercise that he pursued in the evenings as a way of keeping his mind engaged. He said the problem was nearly resolved. He said he thought the solution involved a counterintuitive relationship between the thermal conductivity of the alloy and the rate of expansion at the relevant temperature range. Ivan said he would think about it and they could discuss it tomorrow. Gromov said, "Good, tomorrow." He died before morning formation. Ivan was told at formation by the guard who read the overnight medical report. He stood in column in -39 degrees Celsius and heard the name announced among the night's deceased and did not move, which was the appropriate response, and also, in that moment, the only response he was capable of. He went to work. He worked the full shift. He met his production quota. That evening, in the barracks, he took out his small notebook, the parts log that Kuzmin had given him, and on a back page that was not used for official records, he wrote Gromov's name, the date, and the sentence that Gromov had said to him in December 1937. "Don't feel guilty. Survive. That's the only thing that matters. Survive and remember." He kept the notebook for the remainder of his sentence. Ivan Morozov had now been in the Kolyma for 7 years and 6 months. His sentence was 8 years. He would be released if nothing changed, if no additional sentence was imposed, if no accident or illness ended his life before the arithmetic reached 0 in May 1945. He was 37 years old. He weighed 59 kilograms. He had outlived 214 of the approximately 820 men who had been at kilometer 214 when he arrived.
He knew this number because he had kept count in the back pages of the notebook in a column of dates and names when he knew a name, and dates and prisoner numbers when he did not. The list was 214 entries long. He had begun keeping it in November 1937, after Pavel Savelyev died with his face turned toward the north, and he had not stopped.
The Kolyma Highway, the road for which all of this had been the price, was, by January 1945, substantially complete. The 2,031 kilometers that had lain ahead of Ivan Morozov on the morning of February 3, 1938, when he stood at kilometer 214 in the dark, were now a functioning road, graded, graveled in the critical sections, bridged across the rivers that required bridges, passable by motor vehicle in summer and by sledge in winter. Trucks carrying gold ore moved along it. Trucks carrying supplies for the camps moved along it. It was a transportation achievement of considerable engineering significance in the neutral language of infrastructure assessment. It had been built by prisoners. The scholars who have studied the Kolyma most carefully, among them the historian Anne Applebaum, whose work draws on the archives that became accessible after 1991, and the Russian historian Nikolai Pobol, estimate that the death rate in the Kolyma highway construction camps during the peak years of 1937 through 1939 was between 20% and 30% annually. That is, between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 of the men who worked on this road in its most intensive construction period died each year. Ivan Morozov had not died. He had survived by a combination of factors that he himself, in the memoir fragments, categorizes with engineering precision. The workshop transfer, which removed him from the most physically destructive work conditions. The baseline physical strength with which he had arrived, built over 11 years of factory work. The knowledge transmitted by Gromov in the first summer, which taught him the specific techniques of survival in extreme cold before the first winter arrived. The production bonus meals of 1940, which came at a moment when his weight had dropped to a new low after a difficult spring. And what he calls in the memoir a habit of attention, the practice of focusing on specific, manageable tasks rather than on the overwhelming totality of the situation, which he believes, in retrospect, prevented the psychological deterioration that claimed men who were physically stronger than him. He does not claim luck, but the factors he identified were all, to some degree, subject to the operation of chance. If Gruzgev had not needed a machinist, if Gromov had not been assigned to Barracks No. 7 in July 1937, if Sukhov's interrogation quota had not already been filled the week before March 1938, the road was built, he was still alive. The sentence would end in May. The formal release date for prisoner number 4471B, Ivan Alexeyevich Morozov, was May 4, 1945. The paperwork was completed on May 3. The release process at kilometer 214 involved the return of personal documents which had been held in the administration building safe for the duration of the sentence, and the signing of 2 documents, a release certificate and a non-disclosure obligation, which was a commitment by the released prisoner not to discuss the conditions of his imprisonment, the names of other prisoners, or the operations of the camp with any unauthorized person, under penalty of rearrest. Ivan Morozov signed both. He was given upon release the following: his internal passport returned, 47 rubles in cash, representing the accumulated wages that Dalstroy had nominally paid him over 8 years at a rate that, after deductions for food and housing, amounted to approximately 0.5 rubles per month.
A train ticket from Magadan to Vladivostok in an ordinary passenger car rather than a Stolypin, and a document indicating his release date and sentence completion, which he would need to present at the local NKVD office within 3 days of arriving at his registered place of residence. There was one restriction on his release that was not in the release certificate, but was communicated verbally by the camp commandant, by this point not Gruzdev, who had been transferred in 1941, but a younger officer named Levin. The restriction was this: Ivan Morozov was not permitted to return to Yaroslav. Former prisoners under Article 58 were, as of 1945, subject to residential restrictions that prevented them from living in major cities within 100 kilometers of international borders or within 100 kilometers of certain categorized industrial facilities. Yaroslav, with its motor plant and its status as a significant industrial city, was on the restricted list. He could not go home. He understood this from Levin's communication. He had expected it. Gromov had told him back in 1937 or 1938 that Article 58 prisoners faced residential restrictions upon release. He had hoped that the war, which had ended in Europe the day before his release, on May 9, 1945, had not changed anything. It had not.
He was permitted to reside in towns of under 50,000 population in non-restricted regions. He chose, after consideration, the town of Rybinsk, 80 kilometers north of Yaroslav, outside the restriction zone, with an engineering plant where his skills might be employable. He knew Rybinsk slightly. A cousin had lived there before the war. He did not know if the cousin was still alive or still there. He left kilometer 214 on May 4, 1945, in the passenger cabin of a GAZ truck heading south toward Magadan. The temperature that morning was -8 degrees Celsius. It was spring in the Kolyma. He had been there for 7 years, 9 months, and 25 days. As the truck moved south along the highway, along the road he had helped build, along the kilometers he had counted as days and months and years, he looked out the window at the taiga and the mountains and the frozen rivers still ice-locked in May, and he felt something that he would describe in his memoir, written 12 years later, as a quality of lightness, or rather of relief, but not happiness. I did not know yet if I was capable of happiness, simply the recognition that I was moving away from this, that the number had finally reached 0. Zinaida Petrovna Morozova had received her husband's letters intermittently over 8 years. Some arrived, some did not, and the pattern of arrivals was not predictable. She had continued to live in the apartment on Ulitsa Svobody in Yaroslav, working from 1937 onward in the textile mill, which provided enough income to feed herself and the children with difficulty. She had received a designation of Wife of an Enemy of the People in 1937, which affected her employment options and the children's school experiences in ways that ranged from administrative difficulty to social ostracism. Galina had grown up in this atmosphere. She was 13 when the war began and 18 when it ended. Dmitri had grown up in it too, a small boy when his father was taken, a young man of 10 when the war ended. Dmitri would later say, in an interview given in 1989 when he was 55 years old, that he had very little memory of his father, and that the primary image he carried from childhood was not of Ivan himself, but of his mother reading Ivan's letters at the kitchen table, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently, always with an expression that Dmitri described as a kind of contained grief, the way she held everything very still while she read. Zinaida did not remarry. She waited.
when Ivan wrote to her from Magadan in May 1945, a letter informing her of his release and explaining the residential restriction and his intention to relocate to Rybinsk, she received the letter in July 1945. She had not known he was alive. His most recent letter before this one had arrived in September 1944, 10 months earlier. She took 2 days off work and traveled to Rybinsk by train to meet him. The meeting, which occurred on July 23, 1945, at the Rybinsk railway station, is described in Ivan's memoir in a single paragraph. He writes, "I saw her on the platform before she saw me. She was 38 years old. She looked older than 38. I thought, I have done this to her. Then I thought, no, they did this to her. I walked toward her, and she turned, and I held her for a long time. She did not cry until we were outside the station. Then she cried for approximately 10 minutes. Then she stopped and said, 'You are very thin.' I said, 'I know.' She said, 'We'll fix that.' And I understood that she was the same person she had always been, and that I needed to find out who I had become." Ivan Morozov submitted his first rehabilitation petition in November 1953, 6 months after the death of Stalin and 1 month after the announcement of the first post-Stalin amnesty. The amnesty of March 1953 did not cover Article 58 prisoners. It covered criminal prisoners primarily. But the political atmosphere following Stalin's death had shifted enough that rehabilitation petitions from Article 58 convicts were beginning to be processed.
His petition was submitted to the Yaroslav Regional Court, as the original sentencing authority in 1937 had been administrative rather than judicial, but the rehabilitation review process was conducted through the court system. He submitted with the petition his release certificate, his non-disclosure document, his pre-arrest production records from the Yaroslav motor plant, and a statement from Zeneda attesting to his character and political reliability. The review process took 3 years and 2 months. On January 14, 1957, the Yaroslav Regional Court issued a rehabilitation certificate for Ivan Alexeyevich Morozov, born March 14, 1907, convicted on May 4, 1937, under Article 58, Paragraph 10. The certificate stated that the conviction had been without legal foundation, and that Ivan Morozov was fully rehabilitated, with all civil rights restored. The certificate was 2 pages long. It was stamped with 3 official seals. It took 3 years and 2 months to produce. The original accusation that he had made a statement about bread rations in a worker's canteen was not referenced in the rehabilitation document. The informant whose report had generated the accusation was not identified and was not subject to any legal proceedings. The investigating officers of the 1937 NKVD who had compiled the fabricated case were not charged or disciplined. Lieutenant Vasily Ivanovich Petrov, who had signed the arrest warrant, had died in the war in 1943. The interrogating officer whose sessions had produced Ivan's coerced signature on a fabricated confession was identified in the rehabilitation file as having died of natural causes in 1951. There were no trials of those responsible. There were rehabilitation certificates. These were different things. Ivan received the certificate in the mail. He read it at the kitchen table of the apartment in Rybinsk where he had lived since 1945. He noted in his memoir that he held the document for a long time. He noted that it said, "without legal foundation," and that he thought about what those words meant in relation to 7 years and 9 months at kilometer 214. He noted that the words were accurate and that they were insufficient, and that this was perhaps the most that documentation could be.
He placed the certificate in the back of the notebook from the workshop, the parts log with the list of 214 names on the back pages. He kept them together. Ivan Morozov began writing his memoir in 1957, shortly after receiving the rehabilitation certificate. He wrote it in longhand, in notebooks purchased at the Rybinsk stationery shop over a period of 4 years, completing the final pages in 1961. The memoir was 287 pages. He titled it simply Trasa, the Road. He did not attempt to publish it. The political atmosphere of the Khrushchev era permitted some discussion of the camps. Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich would be published in Novy Mir in 1962, but the space for such discussion was limited and unpredictable, and Ivan Morozov was not a public figure and had no connections to the literary world. He wrote the memoir because he needed to write it, and because of Gromov's instruction, survive and remember. He gave one copy to Zenaida. He gave one copy to Galina, who by 1961 was a librarian in Yaroslav, and kept it in a cardboard box under her bed for 28 years. He kept one copy himself. The copies of the memoir were discovered by researchers from the Memorial Society, the Russian organization dedicated to documenting Soviet political repression, in 1989, when Galina, then 57 years old, read in a newspaper that Memorial was collecting personal testimonies from the Gulag period. She contacted them. They sent a researcher named Yelena Vladimirovna Zhukova to Yaroslav. Zhukova read the memoir over 2 days. She arranged for it to be photocopied and placed in the Memorial Archive. It was deposited on November 14, 1989. The Memorial Society was declared a foreign agent by the Russian government in 2016. It was forcibly liquidated by court order on December 28, 2021. Its archives, including the copy of Ivan Morozov's memoir, were transferred to the custody of Sakharov Center in Moscow, which itself was ordered to close in 2022. The current location and accessibility of the Memorial Archive materials remain subject to ongoing legal and political uncertainty.
The memoir contains the list of 214 names. Ivan Morozov lived in Rybinsk until his death. He worked at the Rybinsk engine building plant from 1945 to 1969, 24 years, as a machinist, and from 1958 onward as a senior master of the tool shop. His production records at the plant show consistent performance, multiple instances of quota overachievement, and a single commendation in 1963 for the fabrication of a specialized component for which standard tooling was unavailable. He did not speak of the Kolyma at work. He spoke about it rarely at home, and then only in the specific, concrete mode of the memoir. Facts, dates, names, temperatures, rather than in emotional terms. His children and grandchildren describe him in the memorial interviews conducted in 1989 to 1991 as a quiet man, attentive, methodical, who read geography and engineering texts in his spare time, and who had a habit, noted by multiple family members, of counting things, steps, items, sounds, in a way that appeared unconscious, as if counting were a reflex that had been installed at kilometer 214 and never departed. Zinaida died on March 4, 1978, of a stroke. She was 71 years old. Ivan was with her. He outlived her by 13 years. He died on August 22, 1991, the day after the failed coup attempt in Moscow that effectively ended the Soviet Union. He was 84 years old. The cause was cardiac failure. He was buried in the Rybinsk Municipal Cemetery in a plot beside Zinaida.
His daughter, Galina, who attended his funeral with her own children and grandchildren, said in the memorial interview conducted 3 weeks later, "He never called himself a survivor. He never called himself a victim. He said he was a lathe operator who had gone somewhere very cold for a long time and come back. He said the road had been built. He said the only answer to that is to make sure that it is remembered what it cost." She paused in the interview. Then she said, "He also said that he thought about Galina Savelyeva sometimes, the daughter of the man who died in November 1937. He never knew what happened to her." The Kolyma Highway, officially designated the Federal Highway R504 Kolyma, runs today from 2,032 kilometers from Magadan to Nizhny Bestyakh, across the Lena River from Yakutsk. It is paved in sections and unpaved in others. In winter, it is one of the coldest roads on Earth. It passes through landscapes that are, in summer, of startling and austere beauty: the taiga, the mountains, the broad braided rivers of the northeast, and in winter are as hostile to unprotected human life as anywhere on the planet's surface. Travelers who drive it today, and some do, a category of extreme road travelers for whom the Kolyma tract represents the ultimate test of vehicle and driver, report passing the remains of camp structures at intervals along the route: wooden barracks mostly collapsed, stone foundations of administration buildings, the occasional rusted remnant of equipment, the wooden grave markers rotted away long ago. The permafrost has, in many places, pushed up the bones. The historical assessment of the Kolyma camps has evolved as the archives have become more accessible. The scholar Oleg Hlyenyuk, working from NKVD records, estimates that the total number of deaths in the Kolyma camp system between 1932 and 1953 was between 127,000 and 130,000, a figure based on official Soviet records which scholars believe undercount actual mortality. The historian Galina Ivanova estimates the true figure at between 150,000 and 200,000. The Memorial Society's database, compiled over 3 decades of archival research, contains the names of approximately 436,000 individual prisoners who passed through the Kolyma system, a number that continues to grow as additional records are processed. The gold extracted from the Kolyma during the camp period, approximately 511 tons by some estimates, representing a significant portion of the Soviet Union's gold reserves during World War II, was used in part to purchase Lend-Lease materials from the United States. The economic utility of the Kolyma system was real and significant. The cost is measured in the numbers cited above. No senior official of Dalstroy was tried for the deaths in the Kolyma camps. Eduard Berzin, the system's founder, was himself arrested in 1937 during the purge of old Bolsheviks and shot on August 1, 1938, which represents the camp system consuming its own architect. His successors managed the system until its gradual dissolution between 1953 and 1957. The rehabilitation certificates issued between 1953 and 1990 to former Article 58 prisoners and their descendants totaled, according to the Russian Prosecutor General's office, approximately 800,000 individual rehabilitations. The certificates said, "without legal foundation." They did not say more.
Ivan Morozov was not famous. He was not a general, a writer, a scientist, or a political figure.
He was a lathe operator from Yaroslav who went to a very cold place for nearly 8 years because a colleague reported a comment he may or may not have made about bread rations, and because his uncle had been a member of a political party that was extinct and that Ivan had nothing to do with. He came back. Behind him, in the permafrost at kilometer 214 and at every other kilometer of the Kolyma highway, are the ones who did not. The road was built. It is still there. Trucks drive on it in summer. In winter, it is the coldest road in the world, and it is very quiet, and the ice fog sits in the low places between the mountains, and the temperature falls to the numbers that appear throughout this story: -45, -52, -58, -61, and the spruce and larch stand in the cold the way they have stood for 10,000 years, indifferent to the history of what was done beneath them. The individual fate and the systemic failure are not separate things. They are the same thing experienced from different distances. Ivan Morozov counted. He survived. He remembered. His notebook, the parts log from Kuzmin's workshop with 214 names on the back pages, is in an archive somewhere. The archive's future is uncertain. The names do not know this. The story of Ivan Morozov reminds us that behind every name in the Kolyma statistics, every one of the 800,000 prisoners, every one of the 127,000 to 200,000 deaths, there was a person with a name, a family, a city, a set of skills, a habit of reading geography books aloud to children at night. A pickaxe, 4.2 kilograms, swung 847 times in the first 2 hours of a February morning at -58 degrees Celsius. A sentence, survive and remember, spoken by a man who would be dead 3 years later. A list of 214 names in a notebook. If this story stayed with you, leave a like. It helps the algorithm find the people who need to hear these stories: veterans, families, historians, anyone who believes that the number of names we remember is a measure of something important about who we are. Subscribe to the channel. We rescue stories like Ivan Morozov's from the silence that the Soviet system built as carefully as it built the Kolyma highway. A silence designed to last forever, which has not lasted because people like Galina Morozova kept cardboard boxes under their beds. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Does anyone in your family have a connection to this history, to the camps, to the Kolyma, to the years of the Great Terror? I read every comment.